Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. We're mostly in Toronto now, but we do have one friend in Washington, D.C. And we're going to have a schmooze day, which means this is a kind of day when I don't tell people what to talk about. We have to find out what's on people's minds, what's bothering us, or what we'd like to discuss. And we'll find out what's of interest today. We discover the news. Okay, so my friends today are Olivia Ward, who's here in Toronto. She's a journalist. She used to be the international lady at the Toronto Star, but now she's a filmmaker mostly. And I'm not quite sure what film she's been working on most recently. Tony Jenkins is in Washington, D.C. He teaches at Georgetown University, teaches peace. He is also in charge of something called the Global Campaign for Peace Education.
That's right.
That's correct. All right, fine. Here in Toronto with me, although he's just been on the Ottawa River swimming, he tells me, is Doug Saunders, who's the international affairs columnist for the Globe and Mail. And my assistant, Adam Wynne, is joining us today. Adam is an absolutely indispensable part of my life these days. He was a student of mine a couple of years ago, and I knew a good thing when I saw it, so I hired him. Olivia, you want to go first?
The two things were very briefly. I wanted to ask Doug about his new job or posting anyway in Germany, but also I wanted to ask Tony. I'm very interested in peace building, and we're now at a time when peace is more and more intractable for various reasons. It's, since I was covering wars, even it's become much more difficult to make peace or to even know who you're making peace with. So I wanted to ask Tony, what are the ingredients now for peace building?
Tony.
One of the things that's been of great concern for my colleagues and I has been the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the huge vacuum that's been created there in terms of security, and particularly the vulnerable situation of women and children. And I wanted to get your thoughts on, and maybe this relates to the question that Olivia has just posed, but what are your thoughts on what can be done to address the situation?
Doug, what's on your mind?
Well, I'm definitely interested in the question of what to do about Afghanistan at this point. I think I was not somebody who was posted in Afghanistan for years and years or anything. I did a couple trips there during the war. We've heard in previous schmoozes of yours, Metta, from people who are looking at the situation for women in Afghanistan, which was the one thing that the advocates of the continued military occupation of Afghanistan spoke up in favor of, even if everything else had returned to pre-2001 levels in Afghanistan. The one thing that got held out during the past decade was that the rights of women and the safety and security of women in Afghanistan had been improved. And I don't think, from what we're hearing from some of the people in Kabul on your channel and elsewhere, is that this is now falling apart as well. So.
Okay, Adam, what's on your mind?
I'm keeping an open mind today. It's a no agenda talk, and I think we have some fascinating people attending.
Since I have two professional newspaper journalists here, I want to pin you down and get you to explain to me who decides what's going to be covered and what isn't. Because today, the Toronto Star has a big headline, something like Code Red, which is certainly appropriate. It's about the IPCC report predicting virtually the end of the world. And the Globe and Mail has absolutely nothing about it. There's one little 3-inch long piece way in the middle of the paper about, the implications for Canada. And so I started looking at the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the San Francisco Chronicle, of the Wall Street Journal. Some of them have an article about this big report, and about half of them don't. Now, who decides what's going to be covered seriously and what's behind it? Now, it could be a simple explanation, like they released the thing at just the time of day so that some papers could get access to it in time and some couldn't. And maybe tomorrow they'll have it. I don't know. Olivia, you want to know about Doug. So Doug, answer her. What are you going to do in Germany?
By the way, I should note the IPCC report was the top story in the Globe and Mail. It just was yesterday because Ivan and the science reporter got it early, and I noticed that on the homepage there's 3 or 4 items devoted to it now as well. So, in answer to that, it's in answer to what goes on what versions of front pages and home pages and so on. That's a complicated question because some of it is done by humans and some of it's algorithmic and that sort of thing. But as far as assigning things and the structure of that, while there's been interesting developments in how newspapers do that type of programming and staffing, it still often comes down to the ability of particular reporters to get particular things and to follow their interests. But I would say the IPCC report was a big story in a lot of places, and I'm a little bit optimistic about this one as opposed to previous IPCC reports because we do seem to be getting a genuine reaction from both politicians and the media who are not normally responsive to these sort of calls, that this is an exceptional report, including from some of the more conservative voices in the media. But I'm not at all an expert on the internal workings of the media. I haven't covered that stuff since the 1990s, and I'm just another content contributor. So you need to get somebody who's actually in the gears of the machine to talk about that kind of stuff. But I should say, any kind of analysis that says what's the top story somewhere, you need to be asking on what platform and what sense, because generally what's the top item on your screen changes hour to hour. Generally the headline on a story, there's 4 or 5 headlines on any story written for different platforms and different places that'll put different emphasis on different aspects of it, and will change as audience responses to it change. So the old idea that you can simply say what's on the top of the front page and how many column inches are devoted to X topic is not a very useful way to analyze those things anymore. What is, I can't tell you though. I'm not the expert in that. Anyway, that aside, I'm returning to Europe. I was on a research fellowship there from middle of 2019 to midsummer of 2020. And I'm doing another extension of that with the Robert Bosch Stiftung, which is one of those big think tanks that owns a corporation in Germany. They have a very interesting structure of charities in Germany, where a lot of the big corporations like Volkswagen and Bertelsmann, which owns Penguin and Random House, and Bosch, which makes the spark plugs and dishwashers, are owned 100% by a charity. IKEA is as well in Sweden. The charity and think tank that owns the Bosch Corporation devotes its work to questions of cities and migration and that sort of thing. And they're very apolitical and hands-off in supporting research. So I've been doing work on the specific urban districts where a lot of the major crises in socioeconomic crises in the world play out. It's sort of been my underlying hypothesis for quite a long time that a lot of what we think of as being national or international crises are in fact localized crises affecting specific communities and specific physical areas. And I'm looking at traumatized areas in cities that have become social mobility traps, places where it's difficult for people to do better than their parents, you could say. And it's become a study of the neighborhoods that were traumatized by COVID-19, because by not really coincidence, the urban neighborhoods that I'm studying in Russia and Sweden and Spain and Germany and Belgium happen to be which are mostly apartment inner suburban neighborhoods, happen to be the specific neighborhoods in each of their respective cities that have had the highest rates of COVID in the city. In fact, you could say almost all the COVID in the city. And that I've written before about how COVID-19 is mainly a disease of the apartment suburbs. That's overwhelmingly true. So suddenly there's a new life to the field work that I'll be doing, which is that these are people who I was unable to interview after March of 2020, who are in the physical places overwhelmingly most traumatized by the pandemic. And so I'm looking at what are the spatial and political and institutional features in these specific neighborhoods that cause them to be most heavily victimized by both disease and by socioeconomic effects. Anyway, that's a mouthful, but
if I can cut in for a second, Doug, I think that's just brilliant. And I hope it does produce another book, because I've been thinking for some time, I mean, even before, of course, the pandemic, that's exactly what's happening. And you know it and I know it just from being on the ground. But it's something that you see articles done about now frequently, which is a good thing. But still, there are no solutions, and I think that's why I'd be really anxious, should you write it, to read that book.
What I'm wondering is, does anybody have any peace-liking solutions for Afghanistan? Is there such a thing as peace building among warlords, for example? Or, is there any hope for that wretched country? It looks to me like it is really doomed, that it's going to be 20 more years of hand-to-hand warfare, or AK-47 warfare, or, whatever. Is there any alternative solution?
I think we have to put peace building in the context of other types of interventions. So who was it? Boutros Ghali, who framed kind of the 3 Ps, and maybe we could add a 4th P to that. So we have at our disposal tools for peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building, and the 4th P that's sometimes thrown in there is preventive diplomacy, right? And so, peacekeeping is obviously the idea, the vision that we have in our minds of the blue helmets intervening in a particular context, creating safe conditions and spaces where dialogue might be able to emerge. So that's a really important tool. And generally that has to be done, working through, neutral third parties. And peacekeeping can also take place not just through government-sponsored troops, but also unarmed civilian protectors, such as those put forward like a nonviolent peace force and other groups. But of course, we have no rapidly deployable peacekeeping forces in the world. That's one of the biggest failures of the UN system. And so that is obviously presents a challenge, particularly in the case of Afghanistan. And that's one of the things that we're calling to help fill the void, is to get the UN Security Council to step up and make a call, particularly to bring in peacekeepers from surrounding and nearby nations to play a role to support the void that's going to be left by the U.S. Its immediate withdrawal, which is the end of this month, right? And so it's surprising, quite frankly, it's very surprising to me that has not been part of the conversation long before we've known this withdrawal was happening. So that, to me, is a failure of the Security Council, probably some obstructionism related to the U.S. and other permanent 5 members there. Then we have, of course, peacemaking, which is more typical kind of high-level political, dialogue and negotiations amongst and between the heads of nation states and so forth and so on, imposing, top-down solutions on longstanding political problems. And that's good for our short-term solutions. And we're seeing some of this kind of happening dialogue between the US, the Afghan government, and the warlords and so forth, but it's not been, I think, fully transparent or taking place in a space that's been truly safe where people can really voice their concerns. And then peace building, to me, is the most transformative of the three P's and the most critical. It's kind of working, particularly in my mind, from the bottom up. Addressing the longstanding issues, attitudes, beliefs, and concerns that the stuff underneath the surface of the conflict that is exacerbated to the point where it becomes seemingly intractable. So that's related to addressing things like historical attitudes that people have towards different ethnic groups. It might be the ways in which they've been wrong politically over time and they haven't been able to give voice to. It's like it's giving voice to even people like the Taliban, who have really not been sitting at the table with the US and others, because we label them as terrorists, to voice what are sometimes very legitimate concerns that they have, particularly related to US intervention on their land. So that's why I come to, I think peace building is really key. I don't think we've gotten to the point where we thought about what that could look like in the context of Afghanistan. But we need, again, I think the way it really works effectively as a long-term transformative solution is by giving voice, particularly to actors who are kind of working the grassroots or kind of like the middle out levels of society, those in education, universities, faith-based groups, and others, who can kind of dialogue both up and down, within a social system, whose voices are heard by, those who are at the top, as well as at the bottom, creating spaces where people are able to voice their concerns, where people are actually being able to be heard authentically. These are really kind of critical aspects of it. And I think education is the other, key factor of it. And I think in a context like in Afghanistan, the kinds of middle out kind of educational interventions that we've seen that have been most effective in other similar contexts aren't ones that are necessarily directly tackling the problem. It might be education that's kind of more generalized in terms of trying to understand the nature of intractable conflict by actually studying and understanding conflict in other contexts and how it's been changed or challenged or transformed, or about learning about general principles of dialogue, mediation, in conflict resolution, and not just sitting around in circles and trying to say, hey, how do we figure out the problem that we have? We've been seeking to lobby and get the ear of the US government, as well as right now the current members of the Security Council, because as of last Friday, they were beginning to discuss this issue, particularly as it relates to the impact on women, related to women, peace, and security. One is first to this idea of the peacekeeping force, as I mentioned earlier. And we believe that's necessary for being able to get everyone to the table to really have an informed dialogue, something more like a peacemaking process. Second, we've been calling for the utilization of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security as a tool and as an obligation of nation states to call for this peacekeeping force and others to assure the protection of women and children.
And there's a lot to work with in there. I would, just as a caveat, steer away from a framework that sees the United States and its NATO allies as having been an occupying force versus the Taliban being an occupied upon Afghan authentic representation. The various organizations that we know as the Taliban are as much of a foreign occupying force, at least in the non-Pashto parts of Afghanistan, as the NATO forces were. In fact, you could fairly legitimately say that they are the face of a Pakistani occupation of the country, and outside of some corners don't have any kind of legitimacy other than being the current occupying force who have to be dealt with in some circumstances. And that creates the trouble that I think you're referring to with dealing with Afghanistan. Is what is the legitimate authority, particularly in the middle, in the administrative areas, in things like education, that you can hook onto and speak of, which is why I think you're right in saying that there needs to be some kind. You can't really imagine it without there being some kind of peacekeeping force, which gets you back into, is that peacekeeping force just ISAF again? Olivia, what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I largely agree with that, Doug. And the first thing that I'm going to say is, may sound slightly over the top, but in fact, when you look at stuff on the ground, you know that this really ought to happen. I think that all the NATO countries ought to open their doors to any female Afghanis who want to get out and can get out of that country, because the underlying war in this country is against women, and women being the proxy for the values that they hate, whatever that is. So women are, especially women who, under the auspices of NATO, have been able to get education, have been able to get into some more prominent positions, even some of them in villages have been able to do that. And it's become a bit of a given that women are on the rise for some time. And then, of course, things very quickly went south with the incursions of the Taliban. But you're absolutely right. The Taliban are not a legitimate force. They're basically terrorists. They want to impose what their totally uneducated version of how the entire country should live in order to seize power and to keep power. And their method of keeping power, of course, is simply to impose a totally authoritarian, theocratic society, which is in fact worse than Iran, because Iran went through its most violent stage already and executed tens of thousands of people. The Taliban is probably on the same path to do that. And once that's done, women will be completely subjugated. Not that men won't, but men will have a bit more freedom than women will. And of course, there'll be recruitment of children. So they aim to change the entire society and turn it back to, I don't know what century. But I think, frankly, from everything I've seen and everything I've read and talking to people who know more intimately than I do, I just think there is no valid bargain with the Taliban.
It's a good question. Is there any common ground at all? Adam, you have your hand up.
Yes, and I just wanted to say thank you for Olivia for mentioning the situation in Afghanistan, particularly for the women. Metta did a wonderful interview and discussion with Lloyd Axworthy last week, and he specifically mentioned that many refugee women, especially with the pandemic, have been knocked off the queue entirely when it comes to refugee services. And on top of that, they are seeing trends within the Afghanistan context of the Taliban specifically targeting women who are pursuing education, as well as anyone who has had any contact with foreign forces, or anyone that has worked with the United Nations, or anyone that's working for translation services, anything along those lines. So it's very concerning. And he also drew parallels to what we saw with the fall of Vietnam after the Americans pulled out of that conflict, where the victors, in this case it was the Vietnam forces, targeted anyone that had any association with the colonial or military forces, and in some cases executed them or tortured them. And I'm very concerned about what we're going to see in the Afghanistan context. And the Honorable Axworthy also mentioned that Pakistan is already in the process of closing its borders because there's over 1 million Afghan refugees in Pakistan and the neighboring countries. So where will we see these refugees go? And you mentioned that I think NATO countries do have a responsibility to take more refugees, but how will people in Afghanistan fleeing the conflict even get to those safety areas? So a lot of things going on there right now.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about. There's an awkward aspect of what we all should be doing, which is to take as many Afghan refugees as we possibly can. In that, while it is the thing to do because it will save lives, it creates a long-term challenge in returning to peace and stability in Afghanistan. And we know this because we've seen it before in Afghanistan. And the earliest example was after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The United States essentially airlifted the entire Kabul middle class and university educated class and resettled them, particularly in the South Bay area, the San Francisco Bay, the area around Fremont, California, essentially was the transplanted entire Afghan intelligentsia and middle class, which is funny because Fremont, California, if you've been there, it kind of looks like the area around Kabul physically. And there were a few of them a few significant people who tried to return after 2001, when it looked like there was going to be stability, and most stayed at best for a few months or a couple of years, and so on. But Afghanistan is becoming one of those countries that is an entirely diaspora country, at least as far as the middle class is concerned. And there's certainly other examples of that, right? I mean, the entire Congolese middle class basically lives in parts of the UK and France and that sort of thing. And there are plenty of conflict-ridden countries where anybody with any education or political influence that isn't extremist is now living abroad. And that creates a difficulty for any long-term stability when the entire middle class of the country is in exile and is absent. And certainly we've seen that in other places. And I'm not arguing that we shouldn't be taking in exiles. Canada is a country that was built by people, middle class, certainly since the Second World War, by the entire middle classes of various countries fleeing and setting up shop in our borders. It's an enormous benefit to have these people. Now, but is there a literature? Is there a tradition in peace and reconciliation studies of dealing with this problem of the interlocutors who you most need to have a stable society being absent and having fled?
I think that's fascinating. And I don't know that I've ever read anything about that question. Tony, do you?
No, I'm mulling it over in my head. There's nothing that comes to mind, but I think you're bringing up something really, really important for us to think about. And my mind is wandering a little bit too, just thinking about the complications of, the possible refugee crisis there. Yeah, I mean, the refugee crisis is going to shape issues of peace and conflict around the globe in the next 10, 20 years. Climate refugees, others is going to exacerbate conflict in a lot of different ways too. And then you throw on top of that the pandemic shutting down borders, it becomes even more problematic to even consider in this moment what that could look like. And I imagine, both governments, even those that may have had open door, or not open door, but relatively open door policies with squeaky hinges, are probably shutting those doors right now because of those reasons. I mean, even the U.S., we're not allowing Canadian tourists into our country at this moment.
Well, there is a big Afghan refugee crisis, and it's been underway certainly since the beginning of this war, but it mostly takes place in Iran. and a very large part of, so if you talk about the middle classes having fled to Europe and the United States and Canada, the not quite middle classes certainly have fled to adjoining countries, and certainly on the streets of Tehran or Shiraz or Isfahan, the people begging on the streets and the heroin addicts on the streets and so on of those cities are Afghans. And they are very much treated as second-class, undesirable citizens. And even as far out as Turkey, you get a lot of troubles with Afghan refugee street people in Turkey being seen as a problem and being often shipped back en masse to dangerous futures and so on. So I think we need to recognize that this problem of exile is not just the elites fleeing here, but is a neighborhood problem throughout the region.
Yeah, and that's absolutely true, and it is a huge problem. But I guess the terrible dilemma in Afghanistan now is that if the intelligentsia are left there, which would be nice for them to, sort of form a government in waiting and all that, but these rules really don't apply in Afghanistan now. So if they're left, they're going to be exterminated. I mean, my feeling is, and not even necessarily from Afghanistan, but from some other countries I've seen, is that governments in exile can be cultivated. And that may be where some peacekeeping efforts and peace building efforts can go.
Well, that doesn't imply that you think any kind of negotiation or, friendship building measures with the Taliban have any promise. And I have a hard time imagining it. I mean, when I find myself trying to even reach out to, Trump supporters or people that I absolutely loathe, I can't, here I am theoretically a peace activist, and I can't even pretend to be trying to find ways in which we are all on the same team. I just have to say, when there's some people who are beyond the pales for it, as I can tell.
Well, except Metta, there is, and Tony can probably talk about this a lot more, there is a tradition in the diplomacy and politics of peace and reconciliation. And I would imagine also in the scholarship around this, which is essentially the rule that you can't really achieve stable reconciliation until you have the worst actors at the table. And the example that always gets held out is the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, which was attempted, which was a peace attempted many times when the moderate Unionist and Republican parties were in power, and failed because the moderate parties didn't control the crazies, and finally was reached when the more extreme parties of the IRA-linked Sinn Féin and the more extremist Unionist Party were in power and allowed a reconciliation, because the people who actually controlled the terrorists were reaching the agreement. And some people have tried to draw that parallel to Israel-Palestine peace, that maybe it was easier to negotiate when Hamas and Likud were in power, although that did not prove to be an example. So there's a case, but it could be said with regard to the Iran nuclear deal and that sort of thing, that it helps to be dealing with the more extremist branches. So is there a case to be made that the only way to achieve an end to violence the worst of violence in Afghanistan is by engaging with the Taliban, because they are the only ones who actually have the ability to end that violence. In theory, that's an interesting question. I just can't see how in practice, and until, as several of you have said, there's going to be this period of awful bloodshed. I mean, people aren't even reporting out of Afghanistan very much now because it's so dangerous. I mean, the BBC has some of the last remaining crews there. And if you've been watching their stuff the last couple of weeks, it's essentially a bunch of video teams fleeing for their lives across various places and hiding. So yes, but there was an entire dialogue starting in about 2006 or 7 or 8 about the question of talking to the Taliban about whether under the occupation government of Afghanistan, it was necessary to negotiate with the Taliban in order to achieve any kind of lasting peace, even under that framework, when it was assumed that the Taliban would not be under sovereign power in Afghanistan. So I think there's some interesting questions around that. But man, do they ever seem dissociated from the actual on the ground realities right now? You just can't imagine how any sort of peace process would start or continue.
But also, I think, Doug, that one of the problems is that when, having followed the Irish peace process, for instance, very, very intimately, you were really dealing with people who were educated. And I mean, the terrorist group, the IRA, were really under the control of Gerry Adams, and who I remember telling me, well, I just had to crack heads, because Gerry Adams and even McGuinness were educated. They educated themselves in the maze, but they were people who valued education and who had sort of political doctrines rather than sheer naked power. But when you get to the Taliban, the whole structure of the Taliban is to be completely uneducated and to accept that they have to live by a completely outlandish ideology that's based on a false premise of religion. And that's something that, unfortunately, I just wish it were otherwise, but you can't negotiate. I mean, and I don't know if you were, but I was at the so-called Afghan peace process outside Bonn. And I talked to some of the people who came, the local leaders, and they were not the hardline Taliban. They were people who were negotiating for their patch. And basically, they wanted to continue leading their patch and to have some kind of representation in a central government. So that was a formula that kind of worked at the time, but it was also under the auspices of NATO.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say that I think probably maybe Doug's right, that the only way you really get peace is by talking to the people who prefer to have war or are really, really hardline in their point of view, but they are the hardest people to talk to. And if my point was that even if I try to be open-minded and unbigoted, find it impossible sometimes to talk to people I disagree with, how can you expect the Taliban to talk to anybody besides another Taliban? I mean, that's, their point of view is so remote from anything that we would have any common agreements about that it's hard to imagine a conversation. There must be conversations, though. And that's another question, Doug. How true is it still that the Taliban are foreigners? I asked that question the other day of Pervez Hudboy, who's the leading nuclear physicist in Pakistan. He's very anti-nuclear weapons, and so he's not in good standing with the government. But he I think he was implying, and he never really said it very clearly, so I could be misrepresenting him, but I think he was finding that all the Taliban mostly had been, or largely brought in as sort of emissaries from Saudis and all kinds of other, radical Muslim outfits around the world, of course, including Pakistan, that maybe they were more local nowadays, somewhat more local. And I wish I'd pursued that question with him, because I think it's really something that there are good answers to, but I didn't get a clear answer.
Well, just to be clear on one thing, the actual Taliban themselves, their fighters, but also their elites are, I mean, they are Afghans. They mostly Pashtun Afghans. The question is how much political control and clearance they have coming from Pakistan. And to flip it around, how much ability Pakistan would have to rein them in. And I don't know the answer to that. And I hear different answers, including Metta, from people who you've had on that question. But the one consensus you do hear is that the only sort of state interlocutor who could possibly have any influence over the Taliban's course or direction or extremism would be Pakistan.
And Pakistan prefers to deny that they have any influence at all. I mean, Imran Khan says, "Oh no, it's not true. We don't have any. We're not really behind the Taliban." And of course, everybody who knows anything just laughs at it. But there you go.
And it also depends, I think, to some extent on to what amount of control Imran Khan has over the ISI.
Precisely. It's not at all clear whether the government of Pakistan has any ability to control the ISI, or whether Khan and everyone before him lives in fear of the ISI and is threatened. So what are the levers you pull? The United States has funded Pakistan to an enormous degree, has not done a good job of trying to use that influence to pull levers. Although diplomatically, there have been all sorts of things attempted over the years, but I don't know where the lay of the land is now. I don't know where you dig in. I would like to read something in detail on what the potential levers are. What are the actions you could take if you wanted not to cause democratic stability in Afghanistan, but to prevent the worst? To what forces of incentivization could possibly be applied to the various Taliban factions to prevent the very worst from occurring? You'd think under any normal logic of post-conflict transition that there would be an appetite among them, because the entire economy is so devastated, because there's nothing to build on. But as Olivia says, this is an organization that is premised on the idea that literacy itself is a crime, and that institutions themselves and even economies themselves are suspect. So this is a new kind of challenge, and I don't know if any antecedents from previous post-conflict stabilization efforts even really apply well here.
You can see it in the Boko Haram. That's the closest.
Well, yeah, they're literal. I mean, who are very much inspired by the Taliban and similar groups. I mean, their literal name means literacy is sinful.
Yeah. Well, regarding this thing about who's in charge in Pakistan, in our previous conversation 5 years ago, Pervez Hoodboy said, "Well, the army is one thing and the government is something entirely different," as if these were two contending forces, and you couldn't say necessarily who was in charge in any one decision. But this time, I put it to him this way: that now the army got rid of the government and has installed their own government in the form of Imran Khan. And he said something like, "Yes, that's about it." But he talked about the army. He wasn't differentiating the ISI. I don't know how I don't understand the dynamics of the ISI, whether that is just equating it to the army, or I don't know that. Maybe you can explain that, or is it important to even think about it?
ISI, as it's sort of commonly known, is a large spreading outfit. I mean, it's extremely, you might almost say oligarchic. It's extremely entrenched. And basically, it has no loyalty to anyone but itself. However, people like Musharraf, for instance, managed to coexist with the ISI, and by giving a bit and taking a bit, in the financial and the political senses. But now, as we were just saying, I have no idea. I mean, Imran Khan is a whole different animal, and he doesn't have a big history of balancing off the ISI.
Mm-hmm. Why don't we take a few minutes about what we're each up to? And I'd love to hear more about are you making a film now, Olivia?
No, I'm not, because our films have been pretty much on hold for now. It's hard to say what's going to happen because of the pandemic, because at the beginning it was like, well, yeah, this sounds like a good idea. I think we can get it off the ground, but let's just wait. And then there was a kind of slew of despond where people were thinking this is not going to happen, at least in the near term. So it finally got down to the point where the difficulty of getting funding for films was almost choked off, and everybody sort of watching everybody else and waiting. But in the meantime, I'm working on a podcast project.
Tony, you're about to start teaching again. Are you going to be bodily present in front of students? And what is the prospect of being able to run a normal university again this fall?
Yes, I will be bodily present. It's going to be strange, I think, for all of us for the first time in over a year. But I feel pretty confident about Georgetown's policies and practices. There is a vaccine mandate in place, and for those who choose to opt out of that for whatever personal reasons, there's a very strict protocol for testing and so forth and so on, and will continue to be masked.
I'm wondering how amenable students are to being vaccinated. My assumption has always been that the anti-vax people are simply uneducated Republicans, but that's probably simplistic, because I found out that one of my nieces and her husband have both had COVID because they are both anti-vaxxers, and they're so they're younger and not totally ignorant. So
there's a history, recent history of anti-vaccination ideologies or conspiracy theories, or whatever you want to call them, among non-right-wing people, you could say. And we noticed that because you forget there was a crisis during the 2010s of people not getting their kids vaccinated against measles, mumps, and rubella, and which is theoretically legally required in order to put your kids in school, but you can somehow get exemptions to that, which are even more deadly diseases than COVID-19. And one interesting thing we found here in the city of Toronto was that the schools with the highest rate of kids being admitted without vaccination, so their parents went through whatever set of bureaucracies, filling out of forms and whatnot to somehow exempt their kids from vaccination, were the so-called alternative schools. which are almost entirely populated with kids whose parents have PhDs and tend to be on the political center left. And so there is a big pocket of people who I as I say, have come to believe a bunch of woo. You know, you notice in areas like where I live, which are big university educated, left-wing party voting areas, there's all sorts of holistic medicine and naturopathic this and that, and all sorts of things that tend to be tied to anti-vaccination ideologies. And it's okay. This is being flooded by the other phenomenon, which is the U.S.-led, I think, right-wing political campaign against vaccination. But once the dust is settled, we do need to start asking what's happened to otherwise educated and sensible people to cause them to believe this nonsense.
Yeah, I agree with you, Doug. I mean, I hate to cast too many generalizations, different populations, different attitudes that have worldviews that have developed over time. I mean, obviously, addressing people of color in the United States was a big challenge, and a lot of distrust based upon things like Tuskegee and other past incidents that are very reasonable reasons to have skepticism for the vaccine. So trying to create educational campaigns to target those particular groups is a really important thing. I mean, I think the biggest pocket that's left, I can only speak for the United States, the biggest pocket of the left is definitely the kind of the right-leaning political, I don't know, kind of cult of Trump that is still pushing against vaccinations, even though you get, Governor DeSantis and the governor of Texas are just, they are in la la land right now. So that's problematic. But also, what's deeply disturbing to me is when I speak to colleagues outside of the US and Western Europe, educated colleagues, it's not, there is so much misinformation I'm finding with colleagues in South Africa, with colleagues I was talking to in Nigeria recently, being spread rapidly all over the world. The skepticism that people have, well-educated people have, who are not homeopathic practitioners or right-wing conspiracy theorists, is sort of overwhelming the system. And quite honestly, that's going to be one of the greatest challenges to getting the pandemic under control, is obviously finding ways to vaccinate the rest of the world outside of the West. And we've barely begun to scratch the surface there, which is deeply troubling.
And that is one reason, the main reason why I think that so much of this rests with the anti-vax media. That is both social media and mainstream media, like, say, Fox News. But it's all over the place and all over the world. And there has to be some way of getting this under control. Because, for instance, an example that really just threw me was I have a neighbor who is 29 years old, who has an MA in business administration, who is very hardworking and very intelligent, and certainly not right-wing. She went so far as to ride her bicycle to North York from central Toronto to get her first vaccination. And when she finally got it, she got an absolutely horrible reaction. And so I met her the other day and said, well, are you lined up for your second shot? And she said, no, I'm not getting a second shot. And I said, oh, no, Jen, why not? And she said, well, after, I'm fine now, but once I recovered from this horrible reaction, I did a lot of research online. And I found that, this is a real genetic experiment. And among other things, it affects women's ovaries and they become infertile. And I said, Jen, wake up. You can't get your information just from the sewage that's being discharged over the internet. You have to, if you want to do that, at least go to reputable sites, like the CDC, even, Canadian sites. But do not just go online and keep looking until you find something horrifying, because you're the one who's going to suffer in the end.
there's
Yeah.
this built-in structural problem of the internet that I think
Yes.
feeds both things, which is, I mean, some would call it confirmation bias, but it's the simple fact that if you go searching for something, you're going to find it. So if your question is are the bad feelings I'm having caused by some medical conspiracy, you know, is this a experiment on our bodies or something? By the simple structure of the question means you're going to be served answers which are yes. And some people call that a bubble, but I think it's a little different than the bubble. It's a simple feature of the information infrastructure around us, which is that if you are suspicious of something, you will be fed things that confirm your suspicions, even if those things are completely fictional. It's very hard to break people out of that loop. And it's especially true, as Tony points out, in the less developed countries where the streams of information are available to people. Everyone has a smartphone now, you know, are bound to be self-confirming. And we're not in positions where a bunch of white people with notepads are going to come in and break people out of that because of the history of, you know, a bunch of white people with notepads doing things in those countries. So I think you're correct that it's the campaign to break those cycles of misinformation, particularly in the global South, is going to have to be very big, but it's not our campaign either.
Yeah,
It is. You're a journalist. I consider it my campaign, everybody's campaign. We have to do this. And this is the most, of course, heartwarming message to end with. I mean, doomed to failure. Yeah. Okay.
Can I just say, give a tiny bit of hope? I don't think we're totally doomed to failure on this necessarily. I think, you know what, it'd be fun to speculate and have another conversation on whether or not the pandemic would be the same experience if we didn't have this overwhelming presence of social media as the source from which we get our information, and those algorithms are deeply problematic. But to me, and this comes back to the challenges of peace building, I think in the case of the vaccines, and in the case of even beginning to imagine having conversations with the Taliban, people who deny the basic right to existence of whole groups of populations, people deny their basic human dignity. It comes down to issues that are related to kind of worldview obstacles to change. And worldview is something that is nurtured and inculcated over time. It can be transformed. It can be changed. And I'd love to talk about that when we have more time. Obviously, we're out right now. But that has been a lot of the work that I've been doing that's kind of connected to the realms of educational psychology, is understanding the way in which our worldviews are developed, the ways in which they function in a way to prevent existential anxiety. When this new information comes at you that's incongruent with your belief system, you just filter it out. That's an oversimplification of a really kind of complex psychological process. But how do we go about poking holes and getting people to kind of reflect on the worldview that they hold, where it came from, seeing it as open to change and being vulnerable to that, and what does that look like? And that, to me, is probably one of the most tremendous challenges for us to think about in the context of these seemingly sort of intractable situations that we're talking about today.
Well, we ought to have another show about that in particular, because that is, in fact, what our challenge is. All of us, I think, we have some responsibility for participating in that. It's been fun as usual. So thank you all for being here today, and good wishes. Carry on. Okay.
Thanks,
bye.
Thanks, Olivia. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Adam.